Our speaker today is Kirk Newport. Kirk was born in New Orleans, Louisiana, but was raised in California. He went to college at San Francisco State University, and then he served 3 years in the United States Army, followed by careers in hospital clinical laboratories, and then teaching clinical lab science at Del Mar College. He's been a member of U2C3 since 1996. During that time, he's been very active. He was a 2-time board member, including president. He's a choir member, longtime church grounds worker. He is an amateur cellist and enjoys most outdoor activities. Kirk has 1 daughter, 3 stepsons, and multiple grandchildren. Originally raised within the Methodist Church, Kirk is a Buddhist.
Hi, good morning, everybody. Before I start, I just wanted to tip my hat to the band. At the last second, they found themselves working shorthanded, and they're just warriors. They just pulled together and got it done. So Jim and Rob, kudos to you. So again, good morning. Let me put my glasses on. The first thing I would like to say this morning, I don't want you to feel bad if you have never heard of Alfred Russel Wallace. I first learned about him in college. I knew who he was. I knew a little bit about his work. In spite of that, there have been multiple occasions I couldn't remember his name. There was this other guy. What's his name? I go, oh yeah, Alfred Russel Wallace. And there's always something about him that's been kind of under the radar. He's a little bit famous, but he's not that famous. I mean, how many people knew who he was or even heard his name? 2, 3, okay. That's more than I thought, maybe. He's, like I said, he's not that famous, but he should be, and I'm going to tell you why today. Or he should be, especially to Unitarian Universalists, and I'll tell you why. In the interest of full disclosure, the only reason he even popped back into my consciousness is that for some bizarre reason, I was on the computer and I was looking for the anniversaries of birthdays of people who were born like 100 years ago this year. So people were born in 1923. They were mostly actors, actresses, athletes, and politicians. So the first two, just for some bizarre curiosity, the first 2 most important people born in 1923 were Hank Williams and Rocky Marciano. Hank Williams is the country singer, and Rocky Marciano was the boxer. So I said, okay. I said, well, why stop there? So I went back, well, what about people born 200 years ago? So I went back to 1823. Okay. If you got who is number 1 right, I will give you all the money in the world. This is the most famous person born in 1823, and his name is Phineas Gage. Now, I wouldn't have spent 1 second on Phineas Gage had not this either been a bizarre coincidence or perhaps even divine intervention, but there's actually kind of a connection between the story of Phineas Gage and what I'm going to be talking about today. If you can look at the picture, his eye is closed and he's holding a metal bar. He was a railroad construction worker. There was a terrible accident. This bar went flying through the air. He was impaled in his head. And so 2 miraculous things happened. One was that he lived, and the other one was they noticed that after his accident, his personality changed. He started just displaying all kinds of bizarre behaviors. They said he was no longer Gage. So this was one of the first examples in history where they were realizing that there were specific parts of the human brain that were associated with behaviors. And again, this was in probably the mid-1800s. Okay, so that's number 1. Number 2 is Alfred Russel Wallace. And I got Wallace. There's something, oh, there he is. He's a really interesting guy, and I couldn't remember exactly why, so I did some research, and I'm going to tell you why we should know about him. His professions are listed as naturalist, explorer, geographer, anthropologist, and biologist, and he did a lot more stuff in addition to that. He was born in 1823, so this is the 200th anniversary of his birth. I'm going to talk a little bit about his adventures, but this particular website that I was looking at didn't mention the most interesting thing about him, and I'm going to get to that later in the service. He'd come up in some of my biology classes way back in the day, and I also had some sort of vague recollection that there was something odd about him, there was something mysterious or strange about him. I couldn't remember what it was, so I did some reading, and I'm going to talk about that. He was English. He was the 8th of 9 children. Most of them did not live to adulthood. He came of age in the height of the Victorian era. And although relatively well off, his family suffered a series of financial setbacks. So he was not that well-to-do, and he left formal education at the age of 13. So unlike a lot of famous English scientists of that era, he did not go to Oxford, he did not go to Cambridge. He was almost completely self-taught, which makes his story even more incredible given what he accomplished later on in life. In his teenage years, he was working mostly as a surveyor and a construction worker with his older brother, but all during that time, he took a great interest in the outdoors, in nature, in geology, in pretty much anything under the sun. He devoured books and scientific journals. He visited museums. He went to public lectures. Way back in the day, before the internet, they would have these big public lectures, and it was sort of almost a form of entertainment, and people would go, and he would attend these. He developed a very astute eye for all natural phenomena. He used, geology, the soils, particularly how the physical world affected the animals and the fauna that lived on it. He didn't have a lot of money. He was selling butterflies to wealthy collectors in museums. But after a while, he became relatively well known within that community because he was so active and he was just so energetic. I'm tempted to call him a gentleman scientist, which was a term that popped up in those days, but he really doesn't fit that term because those were usually rich guys who had lots of money and lots of time, and they didn't have to work, so they just sort of collected things. He wasn't that. He did not have a lot of money. He was always, in fact, till the end of his life, he was tight for money. So he was definitely set apart from a lot of these other gentleman scientists, that one of which I will mention in a bit. Again, he had no formal education. Everything he did completely on his own. So, what does an ambitious, now he's 25 years old, he's an English naturalist, and what do all English people do at some point in their life? They get on a ship and they sail to one of the most remote places they can possibly find. So he goes to the Amazon jungle, and by the Amazon jungle I mean way up the Amazon jungle. It's a miracle he survived. He blew a piece of his hand off, not knowing how to properly pick up a shotgun. He pulled a dead crocodile into his boat to discover it wasn't exactly dead. Roaming through the jungle, he came, face to face with a panther, and he wasn't armed, and for some bizarre reason, I guess the panther wasn't particularly hungry, and he just wandered off. He caught malaria, which was better than his brother who came to visit him, who caught yellow fever and died. 4 years later, it gets worse. So 4 years after, in the Amazon, he's sailing back to England. They're in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. His ship catches fire and sinks. It took with him almost all his notes and most of his, about half of the animals and plant specimens he collected in the last 4 years. So he's lost a great deal of his work. In spite of these less optimal results, he returns home, maybe not a hero, but he was definitely starting to make a name for himself. There's another picture of him. He's now 31 years old. So what does an ambitious 31-year-old English naturalist do? He gets back on the ship. He gets back on another ship. And in 1854, he sails to another incredibly remote place. At the time, they called the Malay Archipelago. Today, these are now the nations of Indonesia and Malaysia. This is a terrible disservice to characterize his work there, but in the interest of time, I go fast. He does pretty much the same thing. He's collecting animals, he's collecting plants. This is one of his drawings, actually, that he drew later in life. He was actually a fairly decent artist. There's some of his adventures. I don't know if this is one of his huts. He's pulling a gigantic snake out of his hut. So this is kind of what his life was like during his time there. But he's making, pretty much the same thing. Lots of notes, lots of collections. He almost dies from malaria a second time. There's dysentery, there's snake bites, various poisonous insects. It's a miracle he survived. But there are two things that happened on this second adventure. They're a little bit different. Beetles, lots of beetles. There's something called the Wallace Line. See me after the service. I'll explain to you what it is, and just want to move on a little faster. The other discovery that he made changed the course of history, changed the course of scientific history. And ironically, it's one that not that many people are aware of. Alfred Russel Wallace discovered the theory of evolution by natural selection. I'm going to say that again. It was Alfred Russel Wallace that discovered evolution. And some of you are going to say, well, no, he didn't do that. It was Charles Darwin. Darwin discovered evolution. It's a little complicated. I'm just quickly. What happened was, while Wallace was, he sent a paper, it's called the Ternate paper, nobody knows that, to the Linnaean Society, which is a big biological society in London. He was also communicating with Darwin by this time, and he, in addition to sending it to the Linnaean Society, Darwin, he just wanted to kind of let him say, this is what I'm working on. Darwin was in a pickle because he'd been working on evolution at this point for about 20 years. He had already started a book that would become On the Origin of Species, but it was not finished. So he had been scooped by Wallace. And for those of, I know some of you are former academics, in the world of academia, if something is yours, you have to publish first. You can't publish something because someone and say it's yours, and someone else goes, well, I've been thinking about that for 20 years. It's really mine. It doesn't work like that. You've got to publish. Darwin had not published anything. But it wasn't a secret that he had been working on it. So this is, I think, an interesting story that illustrates a lot about the characters of both men, both Wallace and Darwin. So Wallace is still off in the jungle. Darwin is back in London. Darwin, by this point, is actually pretty well known. He'd already published The Voyage of the Beagle. He was a well-known naturalist. And he didn't know what to do, and he said, well, this is kind of not fair. He's going to publish this paper. But I've been working on this for a long time. So they did something a little odd, but to me, it's just a strange event. So Wallace is completely out of the loop. Darwin is talking to his friends, and this is what they decide to do. they're going to, read Wallace's paper exactly as exactly as he sent it, and then they're also going to read 2 private letters that Darwin had written to his friends earlier, and they're going to read them too, basically documenting the fact that, yeah, he'd been working on evolution too, but technically that was like way out of bounds. These were private letters. These were not scientific articles at all. And that's what they did. And the weird thing is they were both okay with it. Darwin and Wallace, I can say, were kind of nice guys. They just they didn't have huge egos. They were happy to work with each other, and that's how it went down. For reasons I'll talk about in a little bit, perhaps, Darwin sort of walked away with that, with the victory, and Wallace kind of got left behind. But it was really Wallace, if you want to be technical, that was the discoverer of evolution. And they would become friends, but I'll tell you that friendship would be tested. So he returns home when Wallace comes back in 1862. Again, The Origin of Species was published in 1859. Wallace gets back. This time he really is kind of a hero. He's been publishing articles. He's associated with Darwin on evolutionary theory. But the religious, scientific, cultural battle for evolution is on. I mean, it's just all hell's breaking loose pretty much all over the world. Both Darwin and Wallace were not brawlers. They did not like to be in the public. They usually did not attend these large public fights about evolution, which ironically is still going on to this day. I don't think we appreciate how revolutionary this idea was. It was dramatic now, and it was dramatic then because it really changed the way we look at the world. At that point, man, Homo sapiens, was considered to be the centerpiece of God's creation. And evolutionary theory says we weren't the centerpiece. We were another creature that had kind of emerged out of the mist, and there wasn't anything that particularly special about us. But maybe there was, and I'll get to that. The argument for what makes us human was on. And some of them are really bizarre. And this is, the whole Phineas Gage thing, the reason I brought him up. This seems so esoteric. One of the first arguments, there's a part of the brain called the Hippocampus Minor. And it was believed for a while that it was the Hippocampus Minor that made us human. I mean, that was it. That was the human thing that separated us from all other primates. And they thought, we have one, they don't, so that's it. That's why we're different from them. That was one of the earlier arguments, and that didn't really work out. But the question remained, what are human? Why are we different from apes? Wallace's story coulda, woulda, shoulda had a really tidy ending right about here. He could have gone down with Darwin as this great naturalist who discovered evolution. He published and continued to publish scientific books and articles for the rest of his life. He was a voice, and kind of like Darwin, he was kind of an exemplar of a lot of the things I think we still value today. Reason. He was all in on objective evidence, imagine that. Social justice, anti-imperialism. He wrote lots of articles in the latter part of the 1800s about these things. He loathed religious orthodoxy. You wouldn't catch him dead in a church, any church. And he was, by all accounts, a nice guy. Just everyone seemed to like him. So what's not to like? In 1869, so this is all kind of moving along, realizing, this is Wallace, realizing he was just about ready to start more trouble, Wallace told Darwin he had something new cooking. I think that was the term he used. Something new. And Darwin must have had some sort of hints or clues, and he wrote him, again, a personal letter. He says, quote, "I hope you have not murdered too completely your child and my child." So something's going to happen. So Wallace comes out with his article, and this is a quote from his article. An overruling intelligence has watched over the action of these laws, so directing variations, and to aid in the indefinite advancement of our mental and moral nature. So like, what? Darwin, to this day, they have his copy of this article. There's a big no written down with an exclamation mark, 3 underlines. So it's like Wallace had gone to the other side. At one point, he was this hardcore, physicalist. It's the hard laws of biology, chemistry. But when it came to human consciousness, he backed away. And then it gets even worse. Wallace was now also publicly a spiritualist. And by spiritualist, I mean he was a regular attendee. They were communicating with the dead. They were levitating objects off the table. There were voices, and people were knocking from the other world. There was a lot of strange stuff going on. He actually went so far as to testify in court cases. This is Wallace defending various spiritualists who had been accused of fraud. Wallace and Darwin, this was not a term used at the time, but they were now frenemies. Y'all know what a frenemy is? He's your friend and your enemy. So the weird thing was, personally they remained friends. Professionally, they had this huge split. But strangely, if it didn't involve consciousness, Darwin was still and Wallace was still completely on Darwin's side. But when it came to human consciousness, he just would not go there. So ironically, first Wallace splits from religious orthodoxy, and then he splits from scientific orthodoxy. So he was sometimes referred to as a heretic. So he was a troublemaker. His argument was that human consciousness, our sense of individualism, our private subjective experiences, things like love, sense of wonderment, creativity, appreciation of beauty, just all these intimate things that we value so highly, were not necessary for survival and would not have arisen spontaneously out of a purely physical world. And that was his argument. If they weren't the production of some sort of supreme intelligence, which is what he was suggesting in his letter, then they had to be possibly some undiscovered physical force that had not been discovered yet. And this was, the 1800s, electromagnetism had been discovered. It wasn't crazy to think that maybe there were other forces we had not discovered at that point. Whatever this force was, though, again, I have to emphasize, Wallace never, ever, ever invoked the God of the Hebrew Bible. This was some physical force, some sort of natural physical force that had given us consciousness. There he is, his dashing Victorian. This was right before he came back to England. He was a little gaunt there, I have to say. He's got these baggy pants on. This was the article he sent to Darwin that started all the trouble. And there's Darwin later in life. If you ever have trouble telling them apart, Darwin lost his hair, Wallace kept his. So there's On the Origin of Species. Great book. This is Wallace later on. This argument that Wallace had, I've heard before in other contexts, and it's actually my favorite argument for the existence of God, somebody's God. And the version goes something like this, a simple version. Again, our brains are unnecessarily complex. If we are the descendants of these primate hunter-gatherers, that's all we need to do. We need to gather fruit, kill small animals, avoid being eaten by large, carnivores. If that's what we need to do, we don't need to understand quantum physics. We don't need to understand advanced mathematics and other complex things. It just doesn't make any sense. So there appears to be some inconsistency with what we're capable of doing and what we need to be doing to survive. And I don't know if I agree with that argument, but I kind of like it. I mean, it is kind of an odd thing, I think, kind of a peculiar situation we find ourselves in. So, quick review. If we review all this stuff, there's God. Either God is involved. Pick one. Pick more than one. There's the Hippocampus Minor, which seems to have faded. I don't think that's a big argument anymore. There's the purely physical argument from Darwin. Or there's some kind of undiscovered spiritual force that, can't say it's not there, but we have not discovered anything in addition to that. I decided to bring Wallace up this morning, not really because it's his 200th anniversary, but it's one of those rare individuals that seems to have crossed all these boundaries. I think it's a bad habit that UUs have. We always inducting people into the UU pantheon. Jesus was a UU. Everybody we like was a UU, and I don't think that's good. I think sometimes we get a little sloppy with that. It's just people we like. I don't know if Wallace would have been a UU. Maybe, but he has this sort of amorphous, flexible nature about him that seems to be pretty flexible. He seems to cross, from one side to the other and back again, and doesn't seem to be the least inhibited by the idea of doing so. So in that sense, I think he would kind of fit into our pantheon. I think, if not even through all these tropical jungles, I think most of us here today have had some sort of journey like this. I know many of us here have started off. I was raised as a Methodist. I was a pretty traditional Christian, probably up until my teenage years, and I don't have any problems with looking back on that. In fact, I have kind of some good stories that came out of that. But I changed, and I think a lot of people changed, and Wallace definitely changed. And I was thinking, though, could there be a better place, and this is kind of my wind-up, could there be a better place to explore these journeys than a community such as this, where we can discuss the Hippocampus Minor, or evolution, or some sort of spiritualism force that has not been discovered yet? I suspect it won't be, but I would be kind of pleasantly surprised if there was. I think in one way or another, from whatever source, I think we should all believe in a spiritual purpose. And that's kind of my message to you this morning. And I think that's the message that came from Alfred Russel Wallace. So now you know a little bit about him. Hopefully I don't think he'll ever be that famous, but he could be. Thanks very much for coming out this morning and listening to me.